Surya, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to the U.S. and what made you decide to pursue permanent residency in the U.S. through EB-5.
Hey Sam, thanks for the quick start and introduction. My name is Surya and I'm from India. So talking about my experience about the EB-5 process and also how I've come to the United States and how I spent my time. So I came to the US in 2015 on F1 visa and moved on to H1B in the year 2020. I've been working with a couple of clients. I work in IT as a project manager. So right now I live in Dallas and I have my I-140 approved and in line to get the green card. But meanwhile, while looking at other options and other routes to gain permanent residency in a possibly a faster way, I came across this investment opportunity and I chose to pursue it.
Were there other visa options that you explored or were evaluating, or did you really kind of narrow it down quickly to doing an EB-5 investment?
I did evaluate other routes. As an example, I looked at the EB1 category, and for that, I'll have to be working out of the United States for a year. So basically, it's the L1 visa which I was looking for, and come back to the US as a multinational manager. That way, I'll be able to qualify in the EB1 category, but for obvious reasons and my personal commitments, I might not be able to do that, which is why I was looking at the other options.
Obviously, when you do an EB-5 investment, one of the most important kind of initial things to do is to prepare your source of funds documents and work with a qualified EB-5 immigration attorney to get everything organized before you can finalize what project you're going to select. Tell us a little bit about your experience interviewing attorneys and selecting the attorney you wanted to work with, and then how was that working process to get all of your application documents and things organized?
So as part of my journey through the EB-5 process, I initially did have conversation with multiple attorneys, I should say more than 5. And then finally I was able to find one which is probably more suitable the way I like to work, to be more specific. And then I was introduced to Anahita George by EB5AN. And once I spoke to her, maybe in the first couple of minutes, I made up my mind that I was proceeding with this attorney because of there are a couple of things that I primarily look at while speaking to an attorney. Each individual might have their own preferences, but for me, ease of communication is the top priority. And also somebody who has that experience working with investors from India and documenting their source of funds. So documenting source of funds is usually a tedious process. I have a good understanding because I have my friends and family who've gone through the EB-5 process before. So keeping that in mind, I was keenly looking at somebody who has that experience to work with Indian investors and documenting their source of funds, because obviously with my background, coming to US as an F1 student, I didn't have all the funds with me available here. So I had to look at other opportunities like taking some gifts from my parents or a couple of other routes where I had to source my money from. And I really wanted somebody who has that experience, which is why I was more inclined towards Anahita, and also communication being my top priority. Typically, the way attorneys worked, as I mentioned earlier, that I've spoken to more than 5 attorneys, is that traditional way that we approach an attorney is by seeking an appointment, and usually there's a wait time. But in my case, I usually prefer a bit more quick communication process where I'll be able to sort my things out, which is why in this case, I felt Anahita was really, really helpful and has some great experience in managing and working on the source of funds documentation. And I should really thank EB5AN in showing me those right attorneys that are suitable to work with me.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that source of funds process looked like? Once you identified, the attorney that was the best fit for you, what were the next steps and how long did it take to put together all the documents? And, was this a 2 or 3 hour a day task for every day for weeks on end, or was it just a few hours over a weekend? What was that communication like? And what kind of effort was it, from when you hired the attorney to when you actually got your petition submitted?
Sure. So initially, it took about a couple of weeks for me to work with my attorney and come up with a plan of action on how to source the funds to the US. Because for me, majority of it came from India as a gift. So initially, even though it took a couple of weeks, we had it all planned well ahead so that I can start working with those documentation. And it typically, probably I spoke to my attorney once in 2 or 3 days, couple of hours each time I connected with her. And then since I had a good understanding what kind of documentation goes in, I had everything pre-planned and I had my set of documentation with me except for the source of funds. So it roughly took me about 2 to 3 months, I should say, to gather all the documentation required to show the proof of funds for this petition. Um, but eventually, I mean, for me, it took about 4 months because of obvious reasons. I had certain delays, but then in general, it should take about 3 months of time.
And in your case, were funds coming from both the US and India, or was it all coming from one or the other?
I should say about 20% of my funds came from the US and the rest 80% from India.
And how, in that case, how important was it for you to have an immigration attorney who had, significant experience working, with the Indian, tax regime to, know what records and documents were going to be needed?
So honestly, that was the most important part of my EB-5 journey because without the attorney who has that specific experience in documenting the source of funds coming out of the US is really, really essential. So for me, that was the turning point. That was the main point for me in identifying the attorney.
All right. So, having just gone through this process, very recently, what general advice? Obviously, not every investor is going to have, the exact same background and source of funds that you'll have, but what general advice would you give to someone, considering EB5 with respect to selecting an attorney for them?
So generally, my suggestion would be to pick an attorney based on the individual's comfort level working with them and their experiences in managing source of funds documentation, to be in specific, and also looking for someone who has that extensive experience in documenting all of it appropriately and showing all the channels that the funds came through, irrespective of where they're coming from.
Let's shift gears a little bit and chat a little bit about the project side. So obviously, you did a lot of research before you decided on a particular project. So yeah, tell us a little bit about kind of what your thought process was when you decided you did want to do EB5, and now you were kind of thinking, okay, how do I find the right project that's going to be a good fit for me?
Sure. So initially, when I wanted to pursue the EB5 route, I started looking at different projects out there in the market. There were a bunch of them, and honestly, it's a daunting task to evaluate each one of it and zero in on one. But to me, the starting point was EB5AN, with having the experience of my colleagues or family talking to EB5AN already a year ago. And since I was also part of the discussion, I did meet some roughly about a year ago regarding one of the projects that they had, which is why, since I already knew about EB5AN, I immediately, with no time wasted, started looking at EB5AN and what kind of projects they currently have. And then I came across two of them. The one they have with Ohali in Utah, and the other one was Twin Lakes in Georgia. After further evaluating both of those projects, I kind of felt in terms of my expectations were a bit more aligned with the Twin Lakes Georgia project, which is why I choose to proceed with EB5AN and Twin Lakes. And also, as part of my evaluation, I came across the builders who were involved in both of those projects. And with Twin Lakes, there is Coulter, and Coulter has an extensive experience with these kind of projects. They were part of multiple projects and they've always paid their investors and also completed their projects on time. So considering all of these factors, it enabled me to progress towards Twin Lakes, Georgia, and EB5AN.
Got it. And in terms of the Twin Lakes project specifically, how important was the rural designation to you and the job creation of the project?
So the main reason I was looking at Twin Lakes, Georgia is because it qualifies for rural. And then the other reason, they have all the jobs created already. So I should say, looking at their latest information, that they are almost halfway through their project. I should say about 30 to 40%. They've already completed their construction and the sales are ongoing and most of the jobs are already created. So Twin Lakes has also been most attractive for me amongst the other projects as it's very close proximity to Atlanta, roughly about an hour away from the Atlanta airport itself. And I've also visited Twin Lakes, Georgia, and it's a lovely place for any senior citizen to live there. I imagine myself living there, 55 plus. I told myself if I'm comfortable living here, then anybody should be able to, right? So that's one of the reasons I moved towards Twin Lakes.
So other than Twin Lakes and Mohali, were there other projects that you were considering? And if so, what were kind of some of the key differences that kind of led you to really focus on the Twin Lakes project versus others?
So I've also looked at another project based out of Cary, North Carolina. That was a Westin construction of a Westin hotel in Cary downtown. So I've evaluated the pros and cons, both having the rural area, Twin Lakes, and also the Westin in North Carolina. So it's all about perception, right? And also the way we think. It depends on each individual investor. At a point, I also thought of going towards the project in North Carolina. Since it's a hotel and the recovery of investment, so it depends on the performance of the hotel. And for me, as an individual, my focus is on recovering my investment as an investor, provided there's also a good return on investment. So in terms of those aspects, I definitely prefer Twin Lakes over any other project.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Obviously, when you're selecting a project, the developer of the project, in this case Coulter, and the location and the specific attributes of the project itself are important. But on the regional center side, what was it like working with the EB5AN team, and why what made you feel comfortable working with our regional center, independent from just the project specifically?
So independent from the project, since I've known EB5AN, if I Google for a regional center, EB5AN would be one of the top 3 regional centers that would come up, right? And also having heard of EB5AN for quite a bit now, and also considering the credentials of the regional center, of the people who established this regional center, EB5AN, enabled me, and since I had that positive impact, I chose to proceed with EB5AN.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I guess having just completed the process and gotten your application filed recently, what advice would you have for other investors considering making an investment from the project selection perspective, right? So if you're considering an investment today, what are some of the key points of advice that you would want to pass on to other investors who are, considering making investments in the near future?
So, depending on their personal choices, I would definitely recommend anybody to evaluate any project they're interested to. So, one point I would suggest is look for an appropriate attorney that's suitable for your situation. Example, the source of funds. And also, at the same time, the second aspect is identifying a good regional center, in this case, like EB5AN. And in terms of the project itself, I've also done an independent research with another firm who helped me in identifying the key aspects of the project. And to be more specific about the project that I picked, since even though it was rural, it was in very close proximity to an urban region. Atlanta is a huge city, and everything is pretty much feasible for anybody living on the outskirts of that city, right? And for anybody who's looking at any project, I would say one of the key aspects is the builder. We have to make sure the builder has that experience in completing their projects and also fulfilling their commitments to all the investors, and also evaluate their financial background just to make sure there aren't any legal hassles involved in that specific project. And also in terms of their investment, each individual needs to evaluate the return on investment, the IRR, and also how well a project is established to make a recovery on investment.
Thank you again for taking the time to join us and share your experience. We really appreciate it. And, we want our potential investors to have the most information possible, including, the perspectives of other recent clients who've joined our projects to benefit from when they, end up making such an important decision.
Thank you so much, Sam. And it was a pleasure working with EB5AN. And again, thank you for introducing me to one of your attorneys. And it really helped me a lot in achieving what I wanted to do.